Basic economics. How the economy as a whole works. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and service. Did you know that the differences in living standards around the world are staggering?
Really? I didn't realize the differences were that significant.
In 2023, the average American had an income of about $81,700, while the average Mexican earned $13,900, and the average Nigerian earned only $1,620.
Wow, that's a huge gap. What explains these large differences in living standards?
Almost all variation in living standards is attributable to differences in countries' productivity, the amount of goods and services produced from each hour of a worker's time.
I see, so countries with more productive workers tend to have a higher standard of living?
Exactly. In nations where workers can produce a large quantity of goods and services per unit of time, most people enjoy a high standard of living. In nations where workers are less productive, most people must endure a more meager existence.
That makes sense. What about changes in living standards over time? How do those differences compare?
In the United States, incomes have historically grown about 1% per year, which means average income doubles every 70 years.
Wow, that's a significant increase. So the growth rate of a nation's productivity determines the growth rate of its average income?
Precisely. The fundamental relationship between productivity and living standards is simple, but its implications are far-reaching. Policymakers need to focus on raising productivity to boost living standards. Prices rise when the government prints too much money. Did you know that excessive money printing by the government can lead to high inflation?
No, I didn't know that. Can you explain it to me?
Absolutely. In Germany in the 1920s, a daily newspaper cost 0.30 marks in January 1921, but less than 2 years later, in November 1922, it cost 70 million marks.
Wow, that's a huge increase. What caused such a drastic change in prices?
The culprit was the growth in the quantity of money. When the government creates large quantities of a nation's money, the value of that money falls, leading to high inflation.
I see. So the more money the government prints, the less valuable it becomes, and prices rise accordingly.
Exactly. The same pattern has been observed in the United States. The high inflation of the 1970s was associated with rapid growth in the quantity of money, while the low inflation of the 1990s was linked to slow growth in the money supply.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize the connection between money printing and inflation was so direct.
It's a fundamental economic principle. Keeping inflation at a low level is a key goal for policymakers around the world, as high inflation can impose various costs on society. Society faces a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Have you ever heard of the Phillips curve?
No, I'm not familiar with it. What is it?
The Phillips curve illustrates the short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment.
Interesting, can you explain more about this trade-off?
According to economists, if the government tries to reduce inflation, it often leads to a temporary rise in unemployment.
I see, so policymakers have to balance these two factors?
Exactly. This trade-off is crucial for understanding economic developments and how policymakers can use various instruments to influence the combination of inflation and unemployment.
Can you give me an example of how this trade-off works?
Sure, let's say the government reduces the money supply. In the long run, this will lower prices, but in the short run, it can cause firms to lay off workers, leading to higher unemployment.
Wow, I didn't realize that policymakers had to deal with this kind of trade-off. It sounds like a complex issue.
It is, and that's why the Phillips curve remains a controversial topic among economists. But most agree that there is a short-run trade-off between inflation and unemployment.